Kia ora. In this video, we're going to be looking at supply, and again, this is one part of our revision series into demand and supply. So we're going to kick it off again with a simple definition of supply. So our definition of supply is the quantity of a good or service producers are, again, keywords, willing and able, okay, to produce for a range of prices in a given time period. Okay, so again, they have to be willing and able because producers are driven by what we call the profit motive. So if they're not willing and able to supply it, they will not supply it at all. Okay, again, we're going to keep going relatively quickly because this one has a bit of a bigger back end with the determinant. So we're going to keep pushing through it. The law of supply states as prices increases, quantity supplied increases, ceteris paribus, vice versa. This is because it is relatively more profitable, and just like the last video, how we can remember profitability, and they're driven by profitability, we can remember in supply there is a P, and so we talk about profitability, whereas in demand we talked about affordability because there's an A in demand. Okay, so profitability, and this is all because, as I said earlier, producers are driven by the profit motive, so they're driven to make profit, and subsequently, if they can get more money for the same product, they will produce more. Okay, how do price changes look in the supply diagram? Okay, our massive hint here is, you remember, supply to the sky. Okay, so the supply curve is always upward sloping. Okay, so as we can see here, again, I've purposely left a couple things off here just so we can really nail down on some of the small stuff here. So when we see this diagram here, we can see that P1 is going to P2. That is our first movement. We need to put an arrow in there. Really important that we put an arrow in there. Okay, and Q1 to Q2. So we can put an arrow in there, and then our final arrow is just showing the movement along the curve. And remember, price changes of the good itself or service itself is going to be a movement along the curve. And then we're going to get into some nitty gritty stuff around the determinants of supply. So the determinants of supply, I remember them with the petrol CC. It's the easiest way for me to remember them, and I know it's a bit of a stretch, but the hint there is then, if we use supply to the sky, how do we get in the sky? We need petrol and we need a lot of CC, so we need a lot of horsepower to get up there. So that's how I remember it. I know it's a bit of a long shot for some of you, but we will go through some of these determinants now. So political factors, so could be something to do with who's in power at the moment, what their political landscape is. That leads to a change in supply. Environment, so what's happened if there's a natural disaster, whether there's a storm coming through. We think about rice and typhoons going through that region of the world. We can look at in New Zealand, if we want a New Zealand example, we look at our droughts throughout the Canterbury Plains impacting the supply of agriculture. Okay, so they're really key ones. Technological advancement, so we can look at the introduction of AI making jobs that are a lot more effective and a lot more easier to govern. Okay, stuff like that is really, really important, and that's going to change supply. Restrictions on trade, you would have heard about it in the media over the last wee while around the tariffs that President Trump has brought in. These are also going to impact the restriction on trade and ultimately the supply of goods and services around the world, because as we know, our producers are driven by profit, and subsequently, if they're going to be taxed higher with restrictions on trade, like tariffs, they are not going to be supplying as much. Other related goods, this one's a bit of a tricky one, and we think about when one good is supplied, does another good also get supplied? So a really easy example to think of this is beef and leather. Okay, we think about when we produce more cows and we produce more meat from the cows, we also definitely produce more leather because they are joint supplied. Okay. Legal factors could be around new legislation coming in. We've got a massive change in New Zealand at the moment in the Resource Management Act changing. We've also got introduction, I should say, in climate effective bills that are meaning that waterways need to be fenced off in certain regions of New Zealand to protect them from the agriculture that's around them, and that's a really, really key thing. So legal factors can impact supply because ultimately they're going to impact the cost of production. Cultural factors is another one that we look at, especially here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we are looking at cultural factors like rahuis, that are restrictions placed on the land, where you cannot use that land for a certain good. These restrictions or cultural stuff can impact the supply of goods and services. The other big one, if we look at the Middle East in particular, and we look at the alcohol consumption in the Middle East, that's also a cultural and legal issue that impact the supply of alcohol throughout that region. And ultimately, all these come down to is changing of the cost of production. So as soon as the cost of production starts to change, our prices are going to go up. Therefore, it's less affordable for our suppliers, and subsequently, our supply will change. And again, just like in the last model, when we have a change in one of these determinants of supply, we are going to shift the supply curve, as you can see there in the bottom right diagram. Okay, if we're going to show an increase in supply, we're going to shift to the right. Okay, so we're going to move from S1 to S3. And if we are going to have a decrease in supply, we are going to move from S1 to S2. Okay, that concludes this short, sharp revision exercise on supply. Hope this helps, and we'll catch up with you in the next